All right. I'm gonna have a short video on basically the post-Civil War times. I'm really gonna just focus on the way California begins to feel part of the United States, and then some of the racial tensions that are felt in California, particularly against Asian Americans and Mexican Americans. Um, and you're already this week doing the water video, so that's really kind of one of the big things taking focusing on the geography aspect. Um, so let me start off by saying when we think about the United States of America, it really is this kind of Civil War period and following where the idea of a United States, nationally united, I think really comes to fruition. And it makes some sense as like, from the founding fathers time period to the Civil War. Most of the history has been one of constant expansion. And so now with the Civil War upon, the country, now California is part of this country. You look at the post Civil War era and you see how the second industrial revolution plays a role in incorporating California into the United States of America. And so the water video you're watching really does also talk about how industry and technology is able to create California, the modern California, because I mean it happens so quick, right? As we've been kind of seeing, it comes out of nowhere, like it's this major metropolis now. All right. Well, during the Civil War, California isn't that directly involved. Obviously, they just kind of joined the Union. You do have some soldiers go off to fight, but in general, it's kind of pro Republican Party. It that is true. And California did vote to be anti-slave. However, as Starr points out in his book, and many, especially Native books on Native Americans from California, point out, there was a type of slavery against with on utilized on Native Americans in California. Some of this is really awful stuff, honestly, and deserves more looking into. Just the brutalization of the Native Americans, Native Californians. Now, the war is a guy named Thomas Starr King, who's a Unitarian pastor. He's kind of highlighted as the guy who really is pushing California to support Lincoln's cause during the Civil War. All right, so the war ends, and the time for California to really be incorporated into the United States comes with the railroad. The railroads are going to be key for bringing, the Asian Americans, particularly Chinese men, are coming over into California post gold, the discovery of gold in '48. Now they are working on the railroads, and you have these transcontinental railroads brought in that link, California to New York now. So sea to shining sea idea. And this is also the era, post Civil War, it's also the era of the robber barons, people like Carnegie and Morgan and Rockefeller. Well, California has their own big four, and these are the financiers of the Central Pacific Railroad. This is Stanford, Huntington, Hopkins, and Crocker. So these guys all get filthy rich um, by financing Judah's Central Pacific Railroad. So pretty big deal here, and these will become, this is the era of the late 19th century. It's the era of big industry, big money, and expansion with this industry. Is how it develops. there's a short video on the kind of Chinese xenophobia that is native to California that you should look at. And I know you're reading a source on that this as well this week. So let me just talk about that a little bit. The aspect, since you're doing the geography, I just want to talk briefly about some of the racial tensions. So first one will be with Asian Americans. So Asian Americans come to the West Coast first and foremost. It's a Chinese, then eventually Japanese immigration comes. Um, Now we already talked about with the rise of gold, and then also with the railroads. The Chinese were the first to come. This is in light of the Opium Wars. Well, eventually the men start to settle. You start having women coming, and now you have families gathering, and places like Chinatown around San Francisco are formed. Um, and It's in California in the 1870s that you have some really terrible examples of xenophobia and straight up violence being done to Chinese men. In fact, one attack happened in 1871, and even another attack on Chinatown happened in 1877. These are absolutely horrific events in American history. And I think with the recent, here's 2021, the recent attacks that have been happening against, Asian Americans walking around down the street, or even the shooting that happened. It just kind of brings people back to this history, like some pretty ugly stuff happened. And it's crazy. It was California. It's one of the first places. In fact, it was in California its own exclusion laws that led to the National Chinese Exclusion Act, the first act to purposely exclude migrants from a country. Um, and it was a big deal because one of the issues was you had natural born Chinese Americans, right? Chinese Americans. And you have this kind of separation of families that happen because of these exclusionary acts. Believe it or not, one of the ways families would try to be reunited and get back into the United States was through the southern border from Mexico. So yeah, so a lot of this is very little known history. Well, with the exclusion of China and the rise of Japan as an early modern power, Japan and thus Korea, because Korea is around this time period a colony of Japan, you start having the rise of Korean and Japanese migrants into California. Now, this is the Gentleman's Agreement in 1907. So you have more Japanese and Koreans selling into California, the West Coast. Um, Unlike the first wave of Chinese migrants in the mid 19th century, these later migrations have women coming. Sometimes women who are sent from families to a guy they'd never met. They're literally sent. They're sometimes nicknamed comfort women. They're sent over to get married and then support the family back home. Um, but very quickly, just like what happened in the earlier laws, you have an Alien Land Act in 1913 that prevents land ownership of Japanese. And then 1924, now you have a more larger immigration act that prevents Japanese immigration. In fact, all Asian immigration except for um, Filipino American or people from the Philippines. And the only reason about that, and actually they get limited later, the only reason about that is because the Philippines by this time is under American. It's an American colony. It's under American control, and that happened Spanish American War of 1898. So this doesn't get overturned till the frankly about the 1960s. It's a weird history, and what's crazy is California is kind of the center of this, where a lot of this is happening. Now, um, it is also California. California is also the place where Hollywood is going to start, and some of the most famous Asian actors of the silent era and into the early film era is Anime Wong and Kintaro Hayakawa. Um, they're both actors, but unfortunately for both actors, they oftentimes were given very stereotypical roles in Hollywood, and it's interesting stuff. This is pretty early on. They were actors in a very early stage, and so that's them. And you look at Mexican Americans. Remember, this territory used to be part of Mexico and Spain, um, and you have many of these people who lived in the land push off the land once you start having more and more people settling on the land. It was from California. John Roland Ridge wrote basically a Robin Hood tale of Joaquin Murrieta, this kind of famous bandit. Um, that a lot of it's more legend than anything, but it does kind of start to set that this and all the way into in some ways the Mexican Revolution start to set this stereotype of Mexican Americans as bandits and all the other kind of stereotypes that go with it. um, when the gold rush happened, you had Latin Americans from Mexico and Chile, particularly come in and try to strike it rich. The California Constitution was actually bilingual, but by 1870, which is I guess it's just a trend, right? I mean, just look at the last slide. They removed the Spanish language there, so it is this weird late 19th century trend about you know with racial hierarchies. Some of it has to do with like the growing social Darwinism, which was a very popular idea back then, and maybe just a growing xenophobia and nativism, especially because California is becoming more and more settled by um, others, but particularly of European background. Um, Eventually, a big um, immigration shift will happen. This is because of the Mexican Revolution in the from 1910 to about 1921 or so. So you have over, I want to say, somewhere in the upper thousands, maybe a million um, um, Mexicans come into California or to the into the United States. Um, but I mean, there was already Mexican Americans living here beforehand. When the depression hits, this is what's crazy. When the depression hits, you actually have a repatriation happening where Mexican and Mexican Americans are forced to leave the country. Again, a lot of this happens in California. And what's crazy again, these are citizens of the United States who are being put on trains or buses and sent out, which was mostly trains, set out of California into Mexico, and in many cases never been to Mexico before. So it's like I said, it's that late 19th century, early 20th century, some of these racial dynamics, some of the worst aspects of America's history with regards to minorities. You really see the dark side of it here in these acts.